Autumn, 1944. A ridge somewhere east of Aachen. A German Panther hull down behind a fold in the ground has just done what a Panther did better than almost any tank on Earth. It has killed a Sherman. If you were the gunner in that Panther, you had seen this before, and you knew exactly what came next. You had put a 75mm armor-piercing round into the American tank at 800 meters, cleanly, through the front, and the Sherman had stopped, and a moment later, it had begun to burn. Smoke, then flame, then the black column climbing into the sky that every tank crew on both sides had learned to read. The Americans had a grim nickname for it that had got back to the German side, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. So you watched the American tank burn, and you felt what a soldier feels, which is mostly relief that it was him and not you, and you moved on to the next problem, because there was always a next problem. And here is what you did not see, because it happened on the far side of the burning tank, in the few seconds after the round struck. The crew got out. Not one of them, not the lucky survivor crawling clear. The crew. 4 men, sometimes all 5, out of the hatches and rolling off the hull and into the ditch before the fire really took hold. Shaken, burned, some of them. Deafened, but alive, and walking. And 10 days later, those same 5 men, the same commander, the same gunner, the same loader, the same driver, the same bow gunner, who had trained together for a year and knew each other's minds, were sitting in another Sherman, fully repaired or fresh from the depot, doing the same job, together, as a crew. The German gunner counted a kill. He was right, he had destroyed the tank. But he had not destroyed the thing that actually mattered, and this is the distinction that the entire war in the West turns on, and almost nobody ever states it plainly. A tank is metal, a crew is not. A tank can be built in a day by a factory that has never built a tank before. A tank commander, a man who can read ground, control a crew, make the right decision in the 2 seconds he has to make it, keep his head while an armor-piercing round is looking for him. That man takes years to make, and he cannot be stamped out of a press, and when he burns to death inside a machine, he is gone, and everything he learned is gone with him, and no factory anywhere can replace him. Here is the figure that should have ended the argument about the Sherman, and it took historians decades to assemble it, and it is still not widely known. The Sherman was one of the most survivable tanks of the entire war, for the men inside it. Not the tank burned, but the men in the tank, when it was hit, died at a lower rate than the crews of almost any other tank on any side. A knocked-out Sherman, on average, killed fewer than one of its own crew. The other 4 got out. The German heavy tanks, the magnificent, dreaded, superior Panther and Tiger, when they were finally penetrated and killed, tended to take far more of their crews with them. The Americans had built a tank that was easy to kill and hard to die in. The Germans had built a tank that was hard to kill and, when it was killed, very hard to survive. And the German gunner on that ridge, watching the Ronson burn, was witnessing the single most important and least understood fact of the armored war, and reading it exactly backwards. This is not a story about armor or guns or which tank would win a duel. This is a forensic audit of a question that the 2 armies answered in opposite ways, and the question is this. When the worst happens, and in a tank, the worst always eventually happens, what, exactly, are you trying to save? Germany tried to save the tank. America tried to save the men. Only one of those decisions can be undone by a factory. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to start, as always, by taking the German tanks seriously, because the Panther and the Tiger were not just good. They were, in the specific arithmetic of the tank versus tank duel, the finest fighting vehicles of the war, and the men who crewed Shermans knew it and feared them. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at a range at which the Sherman's gun could not even scratch it. A Panther's frontal armor was so well designed that Allied rounds bounced off it, and its gun would go through a Sherman's front, its sides, and out the other side. In a straight fight, at range, head-on, the German tank won, and it usually won without being harmed. This was not an accident. It was the product of a very particular idea about what a tank is for, and that idea sat at the center of German armored design, and it was an idea about the machine. The German tank was conceived as a weapon system to be optimized. More armor, a bigger gun, better optics, higher velocity. The design questions the Germans asked were, overwhelmingly, questions about lethality and protection, about winning the engagement. How thick is the armor? How powerful is the gun? How far can it kill? How well can it survive a hit? And by those measures, they built magnificent machines. But notice what is missing from that list of questions. Notice what the German design process was not centrally organized around. Getting out. The survival of the crew, in the event that the tank was penetrated, was not a primary design driver in the German heavy tanks. It was assumed, to the extent it was considered at all, that the answer to being hit was not to be hit, that the armor and the gun and the range advantage would keep you from being penetrated in the first place. The whole philosophy was built on winning the duel so decisively that the question of surviving a loss did not arise. And when the tank was penetrated anyway, as tanks always eventually are, the German design gave its crew a poor set of options. Take the Panther. When an armor-piercing round penetrated a Panther and struck the ammunition, the results were catastrophic, because of where and how the ammunition was stored, much of it in the sponsons, along the sides of the hull, above the tracks, exactly where a side penetration would find it. A Panther that was penetrated in the side had a very high chance of a catastrophic ammunition fire. And getting out of a penetrated Panther or Tiger was not easy. The tanks were large, the interiors were crowded, the crew positions were deep, and the hatches, particularly for the men down in the hull, the driver and the radio operator, were not generous and were not easy to get through quickly, with the tank filling with smoke and flame and the possibility of the ammunition going up at any second. The loader, the gunner, the commander, the driver, the radio operator, each of these men, in a burning German heavy tank, faced a harder, slower, more obstructed path to open air than his American counterpart. And in a burning tank, the difference between a fast exit and a slow one is the difference between a man who walks away and a man who does not. Now stack the German manpower situation on top of this, because it is the part that makes the whole thing tragic rather than merely inefficient. By 1944, Germany was running out of men. Not equipment first, men. The trained, experienced core of the German army was being ground away on the Eastern Front and in the West, and it could not be replaced at the rate it was being lost. Veteran tank commanders, men with years of experience, were dying, and the replacements coming up were younger, less trained, less experienced, thrown into the finest tanks in the world with a fraction of the preparation their predecessors had received. So Germany was in the worst possible position. It had a shrinking pool of trained crews, and it had tanks that, when they were finally knocked out, were disproportionately likely to kill the very crews it could not replace. Every Tiger that brewed up with its crew inside was not just a lost tank. It was a lost crew, and the crew was the part Germany could not manufacture. There is one more thing worth understanding here, because it cuts against the whole image of German tanks as perfectly designed machines. In some important human respects, they were not well designed at all. They were designed for the gun and the armor, and the men were fitted in around them. The interiors were built around enormous guns and enormous engines, and the men were packed into the spaces left over. A loader in a Tiger worked a gun whose shells were long and heavy and awkward, in a confined space, and when things went wrong he had to get himself, and that awkwardness, out through a hatch that had not been designed with his rapid escape as the first priority. The German designers had, in effect, made a decision without ever formally making it. They had decided that the tank's job was to win, and that the crew's job was to serve the tank. The machine was the master, and the men were its servants, and the design reflected that all the way down. The Americans had made the opposite decision, also without quite formally making it. In the Sherman, the tank served the crew. It was there to carry them, to let them fight, and above all to let them get out. The machine was the servant, and the men were the masters. You cannot see that difference in a specification sheet. It does not show up in armor thickness or muzzle velocity. It shows up only in one place, in the ditch beside a burning tank, in the number of men who are lying there alive. Every Tiger that brewed up with its crew inside was not just a lost tank, it was a lost crew, and the crew was the part Germany could not manufacture. That is the German calculus, a magnificent tank, optimized to win the duel, built on the assumption that it would not be penetrated, and, when it was penetrated, disproportionately lethal to the irreplaceable men inside it, at exactly the moment in the war when Germany had no more irreplaceable men to spare. Now let us look at the tank the German gunner despised, and at the men who kept climbing out of it and coming back. Part 2. The American Answer. The Sherman's reputation is the great injustice of the Second World War, and to understand the American answer, you first have to clear away the myth, because the myth gets the most important fact exactly upside down. The myth is that the Sherman was a death trap, the Ronson, the tank that burned, the tank that got American boys killed because it was inferior to the German armor it faced. The burning part is true. Early Shermans did catch fire when penetrated, and they caught fire readily, and the crews knew it and hated it. But here is the fact the myth buries. The Sherman burned, and the crew lived. The fire was, overwhelmingly, an ammunition fire, not a fuel fire, whatever the Ronson nickname implied. And the Americans worked out very quickly, from combat analysis, that the enemy of the tank crew was not the petrol tank. It was the ammunition, stored around the hull, catching fire when a penetrating round tore into it. And having identified the problem precisely, the way the Americans always identified problems precisely, by studying their own knocked-out tanks with cold statistical attention, they fixed it. The fix was called wet stowage. They took the ammunition out of the vulnerable positions high in the hull sponsons, and they relocated it down low, in the bottom of the hull, below the turret ring, in bins that were surrounded by jackets of water mixed with a rust inhibitor and antifreeze. The idea was simple and brilliant. If a penetrating round struck the ammunition bin, the water jacket would rupture and douse the propellant, and the fire would either not start or would be smothered before it could take the whole tank. And it worked. The proportion of wet stowage Shermans that burned when penetrated dropped dramatically compared to the earlier dry stowage tanks. The Ronson began to go out. But notice what that fix actually reveals. Notice the mindset behind it. The Americans did not respond to the burning problem by saying, "Our crews must be braver." They did not say, "They must accept that a tank is a dangerous place." They did not treat the fire as an unavoidable feature of tank warfare to be endured. They treated it as a defect, a specific, identifiable, fixable defect. They found the cause, they engineered a solution, and they built the solution into the production line. Same as the socks, same as the plasma, same as everything in this entire series. A problem is a thing you fix, not a thing you endure. And the burning was only half of it. The other half was the getting out. And here the Sherman was, from the very beginning, quietly superior, in a way that never makes it into the arguments about armor thickness. The Sherman was designed to be escaped. Its hatches were reasonably sized and reasonably placed. The turret crew had good access to the top. Later Shermans added a hatch for the loader, so that he had his own way out instead of having to cross the turret. There was an escape hatch in the floor of the hull, through which the driver and bow gunner could drop down out of the bottom of the tank, out of the enemy's line of sight, if the top was not an option. The interior, while never spacious, was laid out so that men could move and get clear. The whole machine, in its unglamorous way, had been designed with the quiet assumption that it might be hit, and that when it was hit, the men inside should have every possible chance of getting out alive. And they did, over and over. That is the reason for the thing the German gunner could not explain. The Sherman he killed on Tuesday was crewed, the following week, by the same men, because those men had climbed out of the first one, walked to the rear, drawn a new tank, and gone back to work. The tank was consumable. The Americans had built it to be consumable, and they built it in numbers that made its loss survivable at the level of the army. But the crew was not consumable, and the Americans knew it, and so they had built the consumable tank around the one component that was not consumable, the 5 trained men inside it. And they had done everything in their power to make sure that when the cheap, replaceable, mass-produced machine finally died, the expensive, irreplaceable human beings inside it did not die with it. That is the whole philosophy. In one sentence, spend the steel to save the men. Because you can always make more steel. And I want to give you the number that proves this was not sentiment, but measurable fact, because the number is astonishing, and it took a long time for anyone to assemble it. When researchers went back, after the war, and studied what actually happened to Sherman crews when their tanks were knocked out, they found that the average number of men killed in a knocked-out Sherman was, roughly, 1. 1 man out of 5, which means that 4 out of 5, on average, survived the loss of the tank. Sit with that, against the picture in your head, the Ronson, the death trap, the tank that got a generation of American boys incinerated. And the reality is that when one was knocked out, 4 of its 5 crewmen, on average, walked away from it. The myth had it precisely backwards. It looked at the flames and concluded that the men died. The truth was that the tank died and the men lived. And the flames the myth fixated on were, after wet stowage, increasingly flames in an empty tank, because the crew were already out and in the ditch. Where did the myth come from then? Partly from the early dry stowage tanks, which really did burn with the crew still aboard more often. Partly from a single influential post-war account by a man with an axe to grind. And partly from a very human thing. A burning tank is a spectacular, unforgettable, horrifying sight, and it burns itself into the memory in a way that the far less dramatic image, 5 men crawling out of the smoke and walking to the rear, simply does not. The eye remembers the fire. It does not count the survivors. But the American army counted the survivors. That was the whole point. It was an army that counted everything, coldly, statistically, without romance. And the counting is what told it that the tank was fine to lose as long as the men got out. And the counting is what drove every improvement that made sure they did. Part 3. The River of Steel. Everything about the American armored system was built to make the tank cheap and the crew precious. And once you see it that way, every decision that looks strange starts to make sense. Start with the numbers, because they are the foundation of the whole thing. The United States built nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks. Add the variants, the tank destroyers on the same chassis, the recovery vehicles, the self-propelled guns, and the number of Sherman-based vehicles climbs far higher. It was one of the most produced armored vehicles in history. At that scale, an individual tank is not precious. It cannot be. When you are building them by the tens of thousands, the loss of any one of them is a rounding error. The tank becomes, in the cold logic of the system, ammunition, something you expect to expend. And that abundance is exactly what made the American attitude to crew survival rational. If tanks were scarce and precious, you might be tempted to build a tank that protected the machine at the expense of the men, on the grounds that the machine was harder to replace. That is, in effect, the corner the Germans were backed into. Their tanks were scarce, so their tanks had to survive, so the design optimized for the tank. The Americans had so many tanks that they could afford to stop caring about the individual tank and start caring about the individual man. Abundance of steel bought them the freedom to be protective of flesh, and then they built the system that got the crew back into action. A Sherman crew whose tank was knocked out did not cease to exist as a unit. They were a trained team, and the American replacement system, for all its many faults, and it had many, was capable of taking that intact crew and remounting it in a new vehicle and returning it to its battalion. The crew's experience was preserved. The year they had spent learning to work together was not thrown away because a single machine had been lost. Compare that to the German trajectory. A veteran German crew in a burning Tiger, taking casualties as they struggled to get out, might lose 2 or 3 of its men in the seconds after penetration. The survivors were then folded into scratch crews, mixed with green replacements, their hard-won cohesion diluted. Every knocked-out German heavy tank degraded not just the tank inventory, but the human capital of the entire armored force. The two systems were moving in opposite directions. The American system preserved crews and spent tanks. The German system spent crews to try to preserve tanks, and lost both anyway, because in the end, the tanks were destroyed regardless, and the crews were destroyed with them. There is one more piece, and it is the medical chain we have already met in another episode, and it matters here too. An American tanker who got out of his burning Sherman with burns, and many did, burns were the characteristic tanker's wound, entered the same extraordinary medical system that kept the wounded infantrymen alive. Forward aid, plasma, rapid evacuation, penicillin, surgeons moved close to the front. A burned American tank crewman had a very good chance of not only surviving, but of being treated, healed, and returned. So the crew survived the tank, and then the medical system helped the man survive his wounds, and then the replacement system put the crew back in a new tank. At every single stage, the American machine was organized around the preservation of the trained human being. And at every single stage, the German machine, through no malice, simply through scarcity and a design philosophy fixed years earlier, was organized around the preservation of a magnificent piece of equipment that was going to be destroyed anyway. The German gunner killed the Sherman. The Sherman's crew killed the war for him, over and over, by refusing to die when their tank did. And behind all of it, invisible, was the thing that made the whole equation work: the American training pipeline, running at a scale and a tempo that Germany could not come close to matching. The United States trained tank crews in enormous armored training centers, in vast open country, with live ammunition, and fuel and spare parts in quantities that a German training school in 1944 could only dream of. An American tanker arrived at the front already having fired his gun, driven for hundreds of miles, worked as part of a crew, because the country had the fuel and the shells and the ground to let him practice. By late in the war, the German situation was the reverse. There was no fuel to train drivers. There were no shells to spare for gunnery practice. Crews were formed and thrown into combat, with a fraction of the hours their American opponents had logged before they ever heard a shot fired in anger. So consider what the survival advantage actually compounds into. The American crew is better trained to begin with because the country can afford to train it. Then it survives the loss of its tank because the tank is built to let it. Then it is patched up by a medical system built to return it. Then it is remounted in a new tank by a replacement system built to preserve it. And then it goes back to the front, carrying all the experience of having already survived, and it survives more easily the second time, and the third. Every one of those stages is an American strength, and they stack, one on top of another, and the result is a force whose average level of experience rises over time even as it takes losses, because it is not losing the experience, it is preserving it, in the bodies of men who keep getting out. The German force did the opposite. It started with better trained men, and then it burned through them, and the experience died with them in the sponsons of Panthers, and the men who replaced them were greener, and the whole force grew less experienced over time, even as its individual survivors grew more hardened. Two curves, crossing. The American crew getting more experienced because it survived. The German crew getting less experienced because it did not. The German gunner killed the Sherman. The Sherman's crew killed the war for him, over and over, by refusing to die when their tank did. Part 4. The German realization. The Germans understood, eventually, that the Sherman crews were surviving. How could they not? They killed the same units again and again, and the units kept coming back. Prisoners told them. Captured tanks told them. The sheer persistence of American armored formations, absorbing losses that should have shattered them, and continuing to function, told them. And there was, in the German assessment of the American soldier, a persistent note of contempt that blinded them to what they were actually seeing. And it is the same contempt we have met in every one of these stories. The German professional looked at the American tanker and saw an amateur, a civilian in uniform, a man from a soft country who had not been forged in the way a German soldier was forged. And there was a grain of truth in it. The American tanker was, very often, a young man who had been driving a tractor or working in a shop 18 months earlier, and who did not have the years of hard professional soldiering behind him that a German veteran had. But the German professional drew the wrong conclusion from it. He concluded that the American was a lesser soldier. What he should have concluded was that the American army had built a system that did not require its soldiers to be superhuman, because it protected them, preserved them, healed them, and returned them, and in doing so, it turned that 18 months ago civilian into a 2-year, 3-year veteran who was still alive to accumulate the experience. The German system produced brilliant soldiers and then burned them. The American system produced ordinary soldiers and then kept them alive long enough to become brilliant. And over a long war, the second system produces more experienced soldiers than the first, not because it starts with better men, but because it stops throwing them away. That is the realization the Germans never fully made, because it required them to see their own greatest strength, the toughness of the individual German fighting man, forged through hardship and loss, as, in a sense, a symptom of a system that was spending its men because it could not afford to save them. A German tank commander in 1944 was superb because the ones who were not superb were already dead. The survivors were the hardened few. That looks like strength, and in the individual, it was strength. But at the level of the army, it was catastrophe, because it meant the force was being sustained by burning through its human capital and hoping the survivors were enough. They were never going to be enough. There were more Shermans than there were rounds to kill them, and there were more American crews than there were Tigers to burn them. And every time a Sherman died and its crew walked away, the gap widened. The Germans were winning the duels and losing the men. The Americans were losing the duels and keeping the men. And in the end, it is the men who fight the next battle. The tank is just the thing you give them to do it in. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle was a tanker, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, a bow gunner, in an armored division or a separate tank battalion, and especially if he was ever burned or knocked out and climbed back into another tank and went back, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. Those men lived a particular kind of fear that is hard to describe, and they went back into it. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war is over. The tanks are being counted, the losses tallied, the arguments begun, arguments that continue to this day, on the internet, in exactly the terms the Germans set. Was the Panther better than the Sherman? Was the Tiger the finest tank of the war? Could a Sherman even hurt a Tiger from the front? And the answers to all of those questions are, more or less, the German tank was better, and the Tiger was magnificent. And no, a Sherman mostly could not hurt a Tiger from the front. And every one of those questions is the wrong question. Every single one. They are the German questions. The questions of the duel. The questions of the machine. The questions of the 800-meter engagement. Here is the right question, the one the Americans answered and the Germans never even asked properly. After the tank is dead, how many of your trained men are still alive? Because the tank was always going to die. Every tank in that war, on every side, was a temporary object with a violent expiry date. The steel was never going to survive the war. The only question that mattered in the long run was whether the men survived the steel. And the American answer to that question was the best answer any nation gave. They built a tank that a German gunner could kill, and that a German gunner did kill thousands of times. And every time he killed it, the men inside it, more often than not, got up, dusted themselves off, and came back to be killed again, except they were harder to kill each time because they had survived once already and learned from it. Germany built tanks that were hard to kill and crewed by men who were easy to lose. America built tanks that were easy to kill and crewed by men who were hard to lose. And a war is not won by tanks. It is won by the men who are still alive at the end of it, standing on the ground that matters, with something to fight in. The German gunner on that ridge east of Aachen watched a Sherman burn and counted a victory. He was counting the wrong thing. He always had been. The tank was never the target that mattered. The 5 men rolling out of the smoke and into the ditch, the men he could not see, the men who would be back, those were the war. And they got up. That is the whole story. Somebody built a machine designed, above all, to let them get up. The Germans could afford to lose tanks. The Americans made sure they did not have to lose the men. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the men who climbed back in. There is a particular courage that does not get talked about, because it is not the courage of the charge. It is the courage of the man who has already burned once, who knows exactly what it feels like, who has the scars, who has smelled it, and who climbs into another tank the next week and drives it toward the same guns. He was not fearless. He knew precisely what he was risking, because he had already lost that bet once and barely got up from the table. He climbed in anyway, because his crew was climbing in, and he was not going to let them go without him. They deserve to be remembered by name, by unit, and by the simple, staggering fact that having every reason not to, they got back in.